WFYI podcast brought to you by Bloomington, Indiana, an American college town offering food and drink, college sports, outdoor activities, live music, cool art, and good times daily. Everyone is welcome in Bloomington. More information at visitbloomington.com.
This is WFYI News Now. It's March 11th, and I'm Darian Benson. On today's show, the Indiana General Assembly's 2024 session is over. We'll have updates on where a few bills landed, including one that would require schools release students for religious education, and another that would fund research on a chemical compound found in psychedelic mushrooms. Plus, we've got a feature story looking back on some of the biggest moments from the last 9 weeks.
I've tried to get people to measure expectations for this session.
Those stories coming up. But first, a bill on its way to the governor's desk would expand several state education programs and increase funding for some students. Indiana's Education Scholarship Account program will open up to the siblings of students who have disabilities, and students utilizing Career Scholarship Account funds could use that money to pay for driving instruction. Some lawmakers vehemently oppose the expansion of the ESA program, which currently provides funding for students who have disabilities. Opponents of the proposal express concern that those students may not be able to receive as much support if the funds are given to more students. However, the bill passed with that language intact. The bill would also let students use Career Scholarship Account funds to get their driver's license. That proposal was removed in the Senate, but was reinstated by a bipartisan committee once the two chambers reached an agreement on the final version of the bill. The bill's author, Representative Chuck Goodrich, says the provision is meant to help students get to their internships and apprenticeships.
I wanted the driver's license stuff back in. So we put the driver's license, modified driver's license back in, which was we lowered the amount that they could spend, and we also added an employer match for transportation.
Another provision in the bill would create a new program that pays for high school graduates to receive training and earn credentials. Details of that program and its funding will be determined during next year's budget session. Schools must release students for religious education under a bill headed to the governor's desk. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Kirsten Adair reports the legislation retained language about religious instruction, but no longer allows clergy to work as chaplains in schools.
Senator Jeff Rotz, one of the bill's sponsors, says this type of religious education is important because it helps students build character. He says any students who want that education should be able to receive it. Some Senate lawmakers opposed the bill. Senator Andrea Hundley says it takes away local control from schools.
We are taking away the power of a local governing body to make a decision for itself about who they partner with in the community.
Lawmakers also expressed concerns about oversight of companies that provide religious education and students missing out on important lessons during religious instruction time. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Kirsten Adair.
Medical research on psilocybin, a chemical compound found in some psychedelic mushrooms, has focused on its potential as a treatment for mental health issues, substance use disorders, and chronic pain. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Abigail Ruman reports legislation headed to the governor would establish a fund for research into the issue.
The legislation brought back language that establishes a fund to give research institutions financial support to study how psilocybin can treat mental health issues and other medical conditions. The bill does not legalize the use outside of clinical studies. Representative Brad Barrett says the legislation allows the state to capture and oversee funding.
They found that this medication is a breakthrough medication, and Indiana can lead the nation in research. This fund just simply establishes a mechanism.
Among other things, psilocybin is being studied as a breakthrough therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, treatment-resistant depression, and substance use disorders. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
And for our final story today, Republican leaders said before the start of session they wanted it to be a quiet one, focused on small tweaks to existing policies. Yet some of their priorities were anything but, including a measure that will hold back thousands of third-grade students and legislation involving one of the most controversial geopolitical conflicts in memory. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports on the short 9 weeks of the 2024 session.
House Speaker Todd Huston said the last 3 legislative sessions before this year were aggressive. He wanted 2024 to be returned to normal.
I've tried to get people to measure expectations for this session.
But if Huston wanted a return to normal, he and his caucus could hardly have chosen a more hot-button issue to make one of their top priorities, seeking to ban anti-Semitism in higher education. How lawmakers defined anti-Semitism was the issue. The bill initially used a definition from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which came with examples, some of which included criticism of Israel. That's what people like Anis Adney, a Muslim teacher in Indianapolis, took issue with.
We should not conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of the Israeli government and its policies.
The Senate took out references to the IHRA entirely and flipped the issue on its head. Now it was Jewish organizations and members of the community like Kaylee Werner staunchly opposing the bill.
In this conversation, there is no room for ambiguity. There is either hate or there is acceptance.
Ultimately, the two chambers reached a compromise, include the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, but don't reference any of its examples. Every caucus this session made literacy a key issue, as 1 in 5 Indiana third graders don't pass the statewide reading exam. Yet thousands of kids who fail that test still move on to 4th grade, and on that, Republicans in the House and Senate largely agreed on the way forward: retention. Legislation requires reading skill tests begin in kindergarten, it creates summer school options for students who need reading intervention, and students who are not proficient must repeat 3rd grade. Some proposed delaying the retention requirement, but for Republicans, that was a non-starter. Indiana, they said, is at a crisis level. But Democrats, including House Minority Leader Phil Giaquinta, said holding kids back has negative social and emotional effects, especially for students of color.
I just can't stomach the idea of saddling our schools with an unfunded summer school mandate, holding kids back without their parents' input, and the teacher workload problems that will result from this.
In many sessions, an issue pops up that no one saw coming, and in that, 2024 was no different. In response to a $1 billion Medicaid shortfall, the state proposed cuts to a program that supports care for children with disabilities. Parents, like Melody Kanzerski, spoke out.
It's discriminatory against disabled people because they're removing the services that will allow my child to stay part of this community. I will not allow her to be segregated by budgetary mistakes.
For a long time, Republican leaders said legislation wasn't needed. Near the end of session, the House approved language that would have guaranteed money for family caregivers, but in the end, that language didn't survive. Democratic Representative Cherish Pryor wasn't happy with the outcome.
When we go back to our districts and people start asking questions and saying that they need help, we can't say that we've done anything substantially to help them.
As the General Assembly adjourned for the final time this year, Senate President Pro Tem Roderick Bray said lawmakers did a lot more heavy lifting this session than he envisioned.
But that's how the process goes, right? People file bills that are important to them and that are important to Hoosiers across the states, and we're here to deal with them.
All 4 legislative caucus leaders said lawmakers punted a lot of issues to 2025, from health care to road funding to tax reform, setting up the state for a session next year that, in Bray's words, could be monumental. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by the following people who live in your community: Abriana Herron, Drew Daudelin, Kendall Antron, who composed the music for this podcast, and me, Darian Benson. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. If you liked today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.